Solitude is often treated like a diagnosis, in rooms where laughter is used as proof of belonging. The quiet woman becomes a question mark, a social anomaly that others feel obligated to explain. The world rarely asks what her inner life contains. It asks only why her calendar is not crowded, why her phone does not constantly light up, why she is not performing the reassuring ritual of being wanted. Popularity is mistaken for well-being, and visibility is confused with value. In that misunderstanding, many women learn to apologize for their own stillness, as if peace must be justified by witnesses. Yet there is another possibility, one that Jung's work makes painfully clear. The narrowing of a social circle is not always a collapse. Sometimes it is an initiation. Sometimes the old bonds loosen because they were tied to a version of the self that was never meant to be permanent. When a woman begins to change from the inside out, the world's familiar handles no longer fit. The jokes that once seemed harmless begin to feel like anesthesia. The endless commentary about status, partners, diets, promotions, trends. Those surface currents that keep the collective dream moving can suddenly taste stale, as if the psyche has grown allergic to what it once tolerated. This does not happen because she has become cold. It happens because something in her has become honest. Jung called the lifelong movement toward inner truth individuation, the slow, sometimes ruthless process of becoming whole. It is not a self-improvement project, and it is not a performance of enlightenment. It is the psyche's insistence that a person stop living as an edited version of herself. Individuation begins quietly, often with discomfort that cannot be explained to anyone who has not felt it. A woman may sit among familiar faces and sense herself fading behind her own politeness. She may watch her laughter arrive a fraction too late, like an echo rather than a response. She may notice how often her yes is a reflex, how often her agreement is a habit of self-protection. Over time, those small betrayals accumulate, and the soul starts keeping score. In Jungian terms, the persona is the mask that makes society possible. The competent employee, the agreeable friend, the dutiful daughter, the charming guest. The persona is not a lie, it is a tool. But the tool becomes a prison when it is confused for the whole self. A woman can be praised for her persona and still feel unseen, because what is being admired is not her interior truth, but her ability to be palatable. And when she begins to outgrow that palatability, when she stops smoothing every edge, stops translating her needs into something less difficult, stops swallowing her own. No, she often discovers a strange grief, the grief of realizing how many relationships were negotiated through performance. This is the moment the culture mislabels as failure. Invitations slow. Messages become sporadic. The warmth that once seemed unconditional reveals its conditions. A woman who becomes clearer becomes less convenient. And convenience is what many social ecosystems are built to protect. People do not always leave because she has done harm. They leave because she has stopped participating in the unspoken agreement to remain the same. Her boundaries expose the invisible bargains others rely on. Her self-respect interrupts old patterns. Her refusal to laugh at what demeans her. Her unwillingness to pretend interest in what empties her. Her ability to be alone without collapsing these become disturbances in a group that prefers everyone to stay mutually dependent. At this stage, solitude can feel like standing in a cleared field after a storm. There is loss, yes, but there is also air. The silence is not the absence of life, it is the end of noise. Jung observed that some people suffer not from being alone, but from the shame assigned to it. They are haunted less by solitude than by the collective verdict that solitude means something is wrong. The mind absorbs that verdict early. If there are fewer friends, there must be less worth. If a weekend is unclaimed, there must be emptiness. If the phone is quiet, there must be rejection. But the psyche, especially a psyche awakening into individuation, may be doing something more radical than the social world can recognize. It may be conserving energy for transformation. The feminine path of empowerment is not merely about being strong in public. It is about being truthful in private. It is about the kind of inner sovereignty that does not require a chorus of approval to remain stable. When a woman stops outsourcing her value to response rates and invitations, she begins to feel something unfamiliar and potent, the ability to stand in her own company without negotiating. This can be terrifying at first, because it removes excuses. Without the crowd, the self cannot hide behind roles. Without constant distraction, the inner life becomes audible. Old grief surfaces, old anger rises, old dreams, long exiled for being impractical or too much, begin to knock from inside. Jung would call this the psyche's return of the shadow, the parts pushed down for the sake of being liked. The shadow is not only what is bad, it is everything that was forbidden. A woman's anger that was labeled unladylike, her ambition that was called intimidating, her sensuality that was shamed, her tenderness that was exploited, her need for rest that was called laziness, her refusal that was punished. When she begins to integrate these disowned pieces, she becomes less easily managed by other people's expectations. She becomes more whole. And wholeness is disruptive. It changes the frequency she emits. Not everyone can hear it. Not everyone wants to. So the first lesson of this solitude is not romantic. It is practical and sacred. The reduction of company can be the psyche protecting its own becoming. If the room demands a mask, the soul eventually chooses the door. If the circle requires self-erasure, the deeper self will start loosening the ties. This is not the same as isolation born from fear. It is separation born from clarity. The difference can be felt in the body. Fearful isolation tastes like shrinking. Transformative solitude tastes like breathing. And in that breathing space, a new kind of question emerges, quiet, insistent, almost maternal in its firmness. Who is a woman when no one is watching? Who is she when she stops auditioning? Who is she when the persona is gently set down and the deeper self begins to speak in its own language through dreams, impulses, sudden fatigue with the trivial, sudden hunger for meaning? The world may call her lonely, but the psyche may be calling her home. As this inward turn deepens, the woman begins to notice a subtle but undeniable shift in perception. Conversations once endured now feel physically heavy, as if each unspoken truth adds weight to the air. She hears the repetition in social scripts, the rehearsed outrage, the borrowed opinions passed from mouth to mouth. Jung described this immersion as the collective unconscious, a shared psychic field where archetypes and expectations circulate unnoticed, shaping behavior from below awareness. Most people never question it. They live inside its rhythms, mistaking conformity for safety and busyness for purpose. But when individuation gains momentum, the collective dream loosens its grip. What once felt normal starts to feel unreal. This awakening often brings fatigue rather than excitement. There is a weariness that comes from seeing through things without yet knowing what will replace them. The woman does not withdraw because she despises others. She withdraws because she can no longer lie with ease. Small talk exhausts her not because she is antisocial, but because it requires a constant translation of her inner life into something harmless. She feels the cost of every polite deflection, every softened truth. Over time, the psyche rebels against this chronic self-betrayal. Energy that was once poured into maintaining appearances is reclaimed. And with that reclamation comes both relief and disorientation. It is here that projection becomes visible. Jung taught that what remains unconscious is inevitably projected outward. When a woman begins integrating her own shadow, her anger, her limits, her unapologetic needs, she becomes less available to carry the projections of others. Friends who once leaned on her emotional labor may accuse her of becoming selfish. Colleagues accustomed to her compliance may interpret her boundaries as hostility. Family members may mourn the loss of her endless accommodation. These reactions are rarely about her behavior in isolation. They are reflections of the roles she is no longer willing to play. Her clarity disrupts the psychic economy around her. This disruption can feel like rejection, Especially for women conditioned to equate worth with usefulness, the temptation arises to retreat back into the familiar mask, to restore harmony by diminishing oneself. Yet, something has changed too deeply for that. The psyche remembers the cost, the body remembers the exhaustion. Returning to the old persona would require a kind of inner amputation, so the woman stays with the discomfort, learning to tolerate the empty spaces where constant validation once lived. In that emptiness, a new relationship forms, the relationship with herself. This is not the shallow self-love marketed as affirmation or indulgence. It is a more demanding intimacy. She begins to notice her own rhythms, her cycles of energy and rest. She listens to what enlivens her and what drains her. She learns the difference between solitude that nourishes and isolation that wounds. Jung emphasized that individuation requires this inner listening, this willingness to let the unconscious speak in symbols, moods, and images rather than slogans. Dreams become vivid, intuition sharpens, creativity stirs without explanation. This inner companionship alters the woman's relationship to approval. When she no longer needs constant agreement to feel secure, she becomes difficult to manipulate. Praise loses its power to seduce her into self-abandonment. Criticism loses its power to collapse her center. Emotional sovereignty emerges not as hardness, but as groundedness. She can feel disappointment without being destroyed by it. She can feel desire without chasing it blindly. She can feel loneliness without panicking. This capacity is deeply unsettling to those who depend on mutual dependency for connection. There is a particular moment in this process when the woman realizes that many relationships were sustained not by mutual recognition, but by shared avoidance. Avoidance of grief, avoidance of dissatisfaction, avoidance of the question, is this life actually mine? When she stops avoiding that question, the gap between her and others widens. This is not a moral judgment, it is a divergence of paths. Jung understood that individuation does not make one superior, it makes one more specific, and specificity reduces numbers. A life shaped by inner truth will always attract fewer companions than a life shaped by imitation. This reduction, however, is not barren, it is preparatory. In the quiet, the woman's inner world becomes more textured. She returns to interests abandoned for being impractical. She discovers a capacity for depth that had no room to breathe before. Solitude turns from an absence into a presence. It becomes a studio rather than a waiting room, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new discernment forms. She no longer reaches outward to fill a void. She waits for resonance. Jung wrote that true meeting can only occur between two individuated beings. Anything less is an arrangement, not a relationship. This truth reframes the scarcity of connection not as deprivation, but as refinement. When connection eventually arrives, whether in friendship, love, or creative collaboration, it carries a different quality. There is less urgency, less performance, less need to impress. There is space for silence, space for disagreement, space for complexity. Such encounters are rare, but they do not multiply through effort. They emerge through alignment. Until then, the woman continues walking her solitary path, not as exile, but as initiation. She is learning to stand without scaffolding, to trust an inner compass not calibrated by popularity. The world may still misunderstand her quiet, but the psyche recognizes its own work. Something essential is being forged in the stillness, something that cannot be rushed or crowded, and though the road narrows, it grows truer with every step. As this alignment deepens, the woman begins to experience a paradox that Jung understood well. The less she chases connection, the more clearly she perceives it. The compulsive need to be seen dissolves, replaced by a quieter curiosity about what is real. She notices how many interactions in the world are fueled by hunger rather than presence. People gather not to meet, but to be mirrored back to themselves in reassuring ways. When she no longer offers that mirror automatically, she is met with confusion, sometimes hostility, sometimes a gentle fading away. What remains is not absence, but honesty. This honesty sharpens her discernment. She becomes aware of the difference between loneliness and longing. Loneliness carries panic, the sense of something missing that must be filled immediately. Longing is slower, more dignified. It is the ache of depth seeking depth, not the void seeking distraction. Jung saw longing as an expression of the self, the organizing center of the psyche, drawing the individual toward what is meaningful rather than what is merely available. In this sense, longing is not weakness, it is orientation. With this orientation comes an encounter many fear, the encounter with one's own unlived life. In the quiet, images arise of paths not taken, talents neglected, truths deferred. There may be grief for years spent performing versions of femininity that were rewarded but not nourishing. There may be anger for how often intuition was overridden in favor of being agreeable. These emotions are not signs of regression, they are signs of integration. The psyche is reclaiming its scattered parts, gathering what was split off to survive. Jung emphasized that the shadow does not disappear when ignored, it only grows more powerful. When a woman allows herself to feel what was once forbidden, those feelings lose their destructive charge. Anger becomes clarity, sadness becomes depth, desire becomes direction. Even fear becomes informative rather than paralyzing. This integration produces a grounded confidence that does not announce itself. It is felt in the way she occupies space without apology, in the way her silence no longer begs to be filled, in the way her presence does not bend to manage others' discomfort. At this stage, solitude takes on a sacred quality. It is no longer something to endure between social engagements, it is something to protect. Jung noted that nearly every spiritual and psychological transformation requires withdrawal. Not withdrawal as rejection of the world, but as incubation. The feminine psyche, especially, has long been denied this right. Women have been taught to be relational at all costs, to measure health by availability. To choose solitude intentionally is therefore a radical act of self-honoring. It says, "My inner life is worthy of time, space, and care from this sanctuary." Synchronicity begins to appear not as spectacle, but as subtle coherence. A book appears at the exact moment a question crystallizes. A conversation unfolds that names something long felt but never articulated. An opportunity aligns with a value rather than a fear. Jung did not see these moments as magic rewards, but as natural consequences of alignment. When the inner and outer worlds are no longer at war, they begin to speak the same language. This alignment also changes how the woman relates to power. She no longer derives it from being needed or admired. Her power becomes quieter, rooted in self-trust. She can disappoint others without abandoning herself. She can be misunderstood without rushing to explain. She can walk away without rewriting the story to make herself smaller. This is emotional sovereignty. And it is deeply feminine, not because it is soft, but because it is embodied. It lives in the nervous system, not in slogans. Yet this path is not without ache. There are moments when the silence feels heavy, when the ease of old belonging seems tempting. Jung never romanticized individuation. He acknowledged its loneliness. But he also warned of the greater tragedy: a life never truly lived. The woman who stays the course learns to hold both truths at once. She allows herself to grieve what fell away without idealizing what it cost to keep it. She honors the past without returning to it. Gradually, a shift occurs in how she sees others. Projection loosens its grip. People are no longer saviors or threats, but fellow travelers at different stages of consciousness. This perspective breeds compassion without self-sacrifice. She can care without rescuing, love without merging, listen without losing herself. Her boundaries become invitations rather than walls, clear markers of where she ends and another begins. When connection does arrive now, it does so differently. There is recognition rather than excitement, ease rather than urgency. The meeting feels less like acquisition and more like remembering. These relationships do not demand constant maintenance because they are not built on pretense. They can withstand silence, they can survive conflict, they honor growth rather than fearing it. One such connection can outweigh dozens of shallow bonds, not in intensity, but in truth. The woman understands now that she was never meant to belong everywhere. Her solitude was not a punishment, but a preparation. It refined her perception, strengthened her center, and cleared the ground for something real. She no longer measures her life by how many stand beside her, but by how faithfully she stands with herself. In this later stage of the journey, the woman no longer questions whether her path is valid. The doubt that once accompanied her solitude has softened into understanding. She sees now that the psyche was never asking her to accumulate companionship, but to cultivate coherence. Jung believed the second half of life was not meant for expansion in the outer world, but for a return inward, toward meaning rather than achievement, for many women. This turning point arrives not with drama, but with quiet refusal, the refusal to keep living at odds with oneself. What emerges from this refusal is dignity, not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that settles into the body and changes how one moves through the world. She chooses her words carefully, not to impress, but to remain aligned. She no longer explains herself excessively or apologizes for her needs. Her yes is deliberate. Her no is clean. This clarity may reduce friction, but it also reduces confusion. The inner and outer lives begin to mirror each other, and the exhaustion that once haunted her starts to lift. Jung described wholeness as the goal of the psyche, not happiness. Happiness is fleeting, dependent on conditions. Wholeness is inclusive. It allows joy and sorrow, strength and vulnerability, certainty and mystery to coexist. The woman who has walked through solitude understands this intuitively. She no longer expects life to be easy. She expects it to be honest, and honesty, she has learned, brings a steadier kind of peace. This peace does not isolate her from the world. It anchors her within it. She can enter social spaces without dissolving into them. She can love without losing herself. She can stand in disagreement without hostility. Her presence carries a quiet gravity because it is not pulled by the need to be affirmed. Others may feel this and name it confidence or calm or even distance, but it is something more fundamental: self-possession. There is also humility in this stage, having met her own shadow. She no longer needs to project it outward. She recognizes fear in others without needing to fix it. She sees insecurity without exploiting it. Her compassion has matured. Stripped of martyrdom, she understands that not everyone is meant to walk the same terrain, and that awakening cannot be rushed or imposed. Each psyche unfolds in its own time, according to its own necessity. The loneliness that once frightened her has transformed. It still appears, but it no longer carries judgment. It is simply information, a reminder of her sensitivity, her depth, her capacity for connection that is real rather than frequent. She meets it as she meets everything now, with presence. And presence, Jung believed, is what allows the self to emerge fully into consciousness. In this presence, the woman realizes something quietly revolutionary. Her life does not need to be witnessed to be valid. Her choices do not need consensus to be true. Her worth does not increase with attention nor diminish with silence. This realization is the foundation of emotional sovereignty. It returns authority to its rightful place, not to the crowd, not to tradition, not to expectation, but to the inner center that knows when something is aligned and when it is not. From this center, she lives differently. She chooses relationships that reflect her values rather than soothe her fears. She invests her energy where there is reciprocity, depth, and respect. She allows herself to be seen slowly by those who have earned that access, and she remains unafraid of walking alone when necessary, because she has already learned the most difficult companionship of all: staying with herself. Jung warned of the tragedy of unlived lives of people who reach the end of their days surrounded by others yet unknown to themselves. The woman who has chosen this inward path avoids that fate. Her life may appear quieter, but it is rich with integrity. She has met herself in the dark and did not turn away. That meeting changed everything. If this reflection has stirred something familiar, it may be because it names a truth often left unspoken. Solitude is not always a problem to be solved. Sometimes it is the psyche clearing space for something truer to emerge. Those who recognize this are not failing at life, they are listening to it. If this exploration resonated, consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who might need it, subscribing for more conversations of depth, and leaving a comment about what this journey has looked like for you. These reflections are meant to be shared, even when the path itself must be walked alone.